Ancient biblical prophets wrote about the future. Today, theologians are poring over those scriptures with a firm belief that their prophecies are coming to pass. Journey now into the world of eschatology on Prophecy in the News with author and lecturer J.R. Church.
The book of Daniel is one of the fascinating books of the Old Testament. There are two premier prophecy books in the Bible, Daniel of the Old Testament and the book of Revelation in the New. Though Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the minor prophets deal with Israel, Daniel takes us a bit further to the great Gentile world powers and the rise of the Antichrist in the last days. I think for that reason it is as beloved as the book of Revelation. On today's Prophecy in the News, Gary Stearman and I are going to be looking at the book of Daniel. We call it Deciphering Daniel.
And J.R., speaking of deciphering, we must begin at the end of the book of Daniel. Daniel, chapter 12, verse 4, these words, "But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even unto the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased." Now, we have here a prophecy within a prophecy. What this says is that Daniel is a sealed book until the time of the end. And what's fascinating about this is that if you go back to the 19th century and before and begin to look at the commentaries on Daniel, they focus on history, on linguistics, on aligned matters that don't really deal with end-time prophecies so much. Then as you come into this century, you find that the commentaries on Daniel are focusing on the revealing of the Antichrist, events surrounding the foundation of the nation Israel, and the book is literally opening itself up in this century, leading us to believe that we are indeed in the time of the end.
Until 100 years ago, there were no commentaries written of the book of Daniel that we know anything about. But today, of course, there are a lot of commentaries on Daniel. And Gary, when I was a child, the ministers that I sat under talked about Daniel 12 as technology explosion,
yes.
Explosion of knowledge. You know, we have cars today, airplanes, and color TV, computers. But I rather think that the main focus of that statement, that in the end time knowledge would be increased, deals primarily with the prophecies. You see, God had a method of closing the eyes, the spiritual eyes, of the chosen people, the Jews. They were blinded to the fact that Jesus is the Messiah. And, but in the end time, Jewish eyes will be open. I think this is one of the primary focuses of that chapter. And it's interesting also, Gary, that in Daniel we have the book sealed. In the book of Revelation we have the breaking of the seals.
That's correct. And on this term that Daniel uses, many shall run to and fro, the Hebrew word shutit is a word that means literally to run back and forth, and it's the action described by tracing across a line of print on a page. And so we have here the idea of running to and fro across the pages of the Bible and beginning to have knowledge increased in the end times.
Over the past 2,000 years of church history, we suffered the Dark Ages, a time when Bibles were locked at the pulpit and the average laity were not allowed to read the Bible. But with the return to the literal interpretation of the Scripture and the Reformation period that has occurred over the past 400 years or so, we have a new love for the Bible experienced, and an opening of the book, and everybody has a Bible today, or at least can get a Bible. And I think that's one of the main focuses of that chapter. Well, as we look at the opening pages or the opening verses of the book of Daniel, we find that Daniel prophesied at the beginning of the Babylonian Empire. And on the other hand, John in the book of Revelation prophesies in the height of the Roman Empire. So we have Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, the four great world empires. Daniel introduces them, John closes them, so to speak. And we are now in the last stages of the revived Roman Empire.
That's right. So we put a sort of a set of bookends on the times of the Gentiles, opening with Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar and closing with that ruler who comes out of nowhere in the end times, out of the revived Roman Empire, and he rules the whole world. And JR, I think it's very important to note one thing in the study of Daniel, and that is prior to Nebuchadnezzar, there was a well-developed civilization, and that civilization was a civilization of idolatry for the most part, under Nimrod and those who followed him. And so what Daniel is doing is moving forward right to the time of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar and initiating the times of the Gentiles at that point, which is very important to remember.
Here's the opening verse of the book of Daniel. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. Jehoiakim was king in Jerusalem at that time. Gary, fill us in.
Jehoiakim, actually, if you go back to 2 Kings, chapter 24, verse 1, you read the story. In his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him. And the Lord sent against him bands of the Chaldees, and bands of the Assyrians, and bands of the Moabites, and bands of the children of Ammon, and sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord, which he spake by his servants, the prophets. That's the story in the reign of Jehoiakim. So it had started back in the days, really, of prophet Isaiah and King Hezekiah, when King Hezekiah, in his pride, had invited the leaders of Babylon to come over and see how great Israel was. He boasted, he bragged, he even took them in to see the secret treasures of Israel. And they got the idea that those would look pretty good back in Babylon.
In fact, as soon as the delegation from Babylon left, Isaiah came to see the king. Hezekiah, he said, did you show them everything? Oh, yes, I bragged a lot. Well, said Jeremiah, thus saith the Lord, everything you showed them will end up in Babylon, not a nickel. That's paraphrasing there. Not a nickel will be left. And indeed it happened, didn't it?
It happened in the reign of Jehoiakim. And J.R., with the death of the royal families of Israel and with the death, you might say, of the house of David, you turn a little switch in history at that point in time. It's lights out, and it's time for a protracted period known as the times of the Gentiles. Very important to separate in one's mind the history of Israel from the history of the world powers. And at this point in time, suddenly we leave Israeli history. King Jehoiakim is raided, it stops in its tracks, and then what starts is the reign of Nebuchadnezzar.
Yes, and fascinating to me, Moses was the one who somehow predicted that this would occur. And it was given in Leviticus chapters 25 and 26 in the Mosaic law concerning the sabbatical years. God told Moses, when you come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. 6 years shalt thou sow thy field, 6 years shalt thou prune thy vineyard, and gather in the fruit thereof, but in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the Lord. And God said, if you don't keep the sabbatical year, I will exile you from your land, and let the land lay fallow, let the weeds grow, so that the land will keep its Sabbaths. So either the people keep the Sabbaths or the land will keep the Sabbaths. Well, obviously, this is the one area where the children of Israel failed miserably. They did not keep the sabbatical years. So over a period of 490 years, from the days when Joshua entered and captured the land and divided it out, until the days of the Babylonian captivity, Israel had failed to keep 70 sabbatical years. Every 7th year in the cycle was a sabbatical year. over 490 years. It was now time for God to send them into Babylon for 70 years. And the Chronicles tells us why. Gary?
Well, J.R., the Lord levels a charge against the children of Israel in 2 Chronicles 36:21 when he says that the Chaldeans are going to come and slay your people, destroy your temple. He says, this is done, quote, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths for as long as she lay desolate. She kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. And here we have the reason very clearly.
Right at the beginning of this world empire of Babylon, Israel is affected severely. When Rome runs its course and the end time comes, Israel will suffer again. The southern tribes were taken into Babylonian captivity in 606 BC. Over a series of 3 invasions, Israel was decimated. In 587 BC, the Temple of Solomon was burned to the ground by the Babylonians. This occurred on the 9th of Av. In the course of those invasions and deportations, Daniel was taken into Babylon. He was of the house of Judah, and he and according to the scriptures, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were taken together. And they were placed in a special unit to be schooled by the Babylonians, for they were exceptionally bright young men. And the king decided that they should be his advisors since they were so smart. And Gary, this says something for the Jewish people in general, doesn't it? They're brilliant.
Yeah, it does indeed. They are given, I believe, a special brilliancy because they're called the people of the book. They are, in fact, the Hebrews, the Israelites, the Jews, are called the people of the name, that is the name of the Lord, or the people of the book. And the Lord gave his people a special kind of understanding. Now, Daniel and the 3 others who were taken with him and who become the subjects of this book were of royal descent. They were of princely descent. They had been raised in the palaces of Israel for special service, and this would have included extreme schooling in the Bible, J.R., and we could say a lot about that. They had a knowledge of the Bible in ways that make our studies pale into insignificance almost.
I have a feeling also, Gary, that they were masters of the language, even though they were young men. They knew not only Hebrew, but the other languages of the world of that day, and probably could speak quite conversantly in the Babylonian tongue.
Yes, that's right. In fact, we find out later in this book, in chapter 2, that they could speak Syriac and understand that, which was the language of the Chaldeans. And J.R., you know, it's just, there's one note here that we should mention. Usually we hear of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, Daniel was the name of the Hebrew prince. In the land of the Chaldeans, they renamed him Belteshazzar. The prefix Bel is the god Bel. In other words, they named him with the name of one of their gods. Likewise, Hananiah became Shadrach, Mishael became Meshach, and Azariah became Abednego. So they changed the names of these princes from the name of Yah or El in the Hebrew to the name of Bel and other deities of the Chaldeans.
It's interesting that Daniel's name was Belteshazzar, which means the king's attendant or the king's leader.
Right.
And over in the end of the chapter, when the king communed with them, that is, he had conversations with these 4, he discovered that there wasn't anybody else like Daniel and these 3 Hebrew boys, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, as they stood before the king in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them. He found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. This speaks highly, I think, of their schooling in Jerusalem before the captivity.
Absolutely.
And the fact that they were conversant in the king's language and could speak intelligently to him in matters of science and even in the matters of the Chaldean religion.
The Jews have an extremely long history of Bible school or yeshiva that goes way, way back. They have special methods of discussing Scripture, and these methods are not easy. They involve a reasoning called pilpul reasoning. That is, a questioning, a harsh, difficult questioning. Are you sure you believe what you believe? And why? You must be able to defend what you believe. And furthermore, you must memorize Scripture in ways, J.R., that we don't memorize Scripture today.
Now, there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is just simply gaining the ability to know. But wisdom has with it the ability to understand why. And I think Daniel and his friends had that power. Well, the king decided that they should eat particular meats, the kind of meats and drink that befits the king's own table. Daniel had different views on that because Daniel ate kosher. And he asked the prince of the eunuchs to allow them to eat kosher. And so they had a 10-day test to see if it would work. And sure enough, the type of foods that Daniel requested caused them to look better and fatter and fairer than the others who had been eating the king's food.
Yeah, and the king's feasts would have included all kinds of meats and fish and specially prepared delicacies with condiments and spices. The Babylonians were known to eat very high on the cuisine ladder, if you will.
I thought you were going to say hog.
On the hog. And as a matter of fact, Daniel would have supremely objected to that because it would have been breaking the law for him to eat pork or non-kosher meats in general. So he says in verse 12, chapter 1, "Prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse," that is vegetables to eat, "and water to drink." So they went on a vegetarian diet. And they went on that diet not because they were, shall we say, philosophical vegetarians, but because they could not eat meat that was not kosher.
And maybe they were preparing for this meeting with the king, and they wanted to be mentally alert. And so they had this special diet, I guess, that helped them mentally to prepare for this time when they would be quizzed by the king. Now, the Babylonian captivity was very important throughout the Old Testament. You'll find this in the writings of the other prophets, and especially of the minor prophets. As Israel suffered, or as Judah suffered these 70 years in captivity, we have the continual promises that one day the Lord would bring back the captivity of Judah and Israel and restore the land, send the Messiah to establish the kingdom of heaven. And especially when we get into the visions, and in the next chapter, when Nebuchadnezzar sees the monster vision with the head of gold and ends up with the toes of iron and clay, we see the whole world scheme as God has it. And what's interesting to me, Gary, is that God declares the end from the beginning, just as Isaiah 46:10 says.
Absolutely, he certainly does. And furthermore, he prepared the life of Daniel, the end of Daniel's life from the beginning. The last verse of chapter 1, it says, "And Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus." In other words, he continued on through several reigning monarchs, even into the reign of the ones who overthrew the Babylonians. And J.R., the first chapter becomes a twofold testimony. A testimony of faith. Daniel and the 3 Hebrew boys who were with him become object lessons in what happens when you live the life of faith and purity. And secondly, it tells us that the Lord specially spiritually gifted these boys for service. So they had faith, they had spiritual gifts, they were obedient, and that sets up then the prophecies that follow.
The 12 chapters of Daniel are divided basically into 2 parts. The first 6 chapters deal with Daniel and the contemporary years in which he lived. But when we get to chapters 7 through 12, we look into the far future, to the end of time, to the second coming of Christ, to the rise of the Antichrist, and the tribulation period. It's going to be a fascinating study as we look into the pages of Daniel. You know, in our series on Revelation, we called it Revealing Revelation. I think we could rightly discuss this one as Deciphering Daniel. Daniel was the most important prophecy of the Old Testament, and for that reason we need to pay special attention to it, Gary.
Absolutely. And again, we must remember that this book is specially written to illustrate the times of the Gentiles. Very, very important in understanding New Testament prophecy. This lays it all out, lays the foundation and the groundwork.
So we have Daniel prophesying in the kingdoms of Babylon and Media-Persia, 2 of the 4. And as we get over to the end of Daniel, we'll see the rest of the story.